Hello everyone, and welcome to our Roman world reflection video. I'm going to start off here with question number 1, then and now. I'd like to give a brief description of Roman society, culture, family, religion, gender roles, economy, social classes, etc. Then consider how Roman society is similar and different to the society that we live in today. And what do you think explains some of the similarities and differences you are noticing? Some people went all the way back to looking at sort of the cultural impact that Rome had from the Etruscans, and kind of looked at that as the beginning and the establishment of Roman culture, the impact that Etruscan culture had on the city of Rome, and how that sort of helped lead to the patriarchal system that they had. Eventually, the kind of rebellion against the Etruscans, how that sort of led to the governmental system, and so forth. But let's get into it a little bit. So as far as family goes, a lot of people did a very good job pointing out the very strict sort of patriarchal system which is developing within Rome. In a lot of ways, you can compare this to some of the other very patriarchal societies that we've already talked about. China, for example, with the kind of very, very much respect that children are supposed to have for their parents, that wives are supposed to have for their husbands, and so forth. And Roman culture really almost brings this to a new level as far as the idea of the paterfamilias, the sort of head of the family being sort of the oldest living male who had, in theory, really a lot of authority. A lot of times it was not necessarily exercised like this, but to the point where they could even, decide people are marrying, power over life and death, things of that nature, which, even though they really weren't all that often invoked, this idea that they sort of had this very detailed position of authority within society, and really reflects on the way that gender roles shake out. How in politics, for the most part, it was very much male-dominated, right? Very similar to a lot of the other patriarchal societies that we've talked about. Religion, though, is really where you see women having more of a role. For example, the Vestal Virgins have a very prominent position within Roman mythology and in Roman religion. A lot of Roman religion in general is borrowed from the Greeks, right? A lot of the gods are essentially the same. They just have slightly different names and slightly different sort of roles within Roman society. So that's another kind of good way to sort of think about Rome, is that it was very much still reliant upon, particularly in the early days, upon one of these more kind of pre-axial age, anthropomorphic sort of nature god type of religion, which they're going to continue and maintain for a substantial period of time. Another thing to really look at is the idea of social class. How that's really distinguishes Rome in a lot of cases from other political systems and social systems that we have seen. This idea that there was this sort of divide between the upper class, the patricians, and the lower class, the plebeians, but how they both sort of had their own mechanisms within society to operate. They essentially sort of even had different political systems that they were operating under, and that's very unique, I would say, to Rome and the Roman world. A lot of people also brought up the examples of the 12 Tabulets, their law code. And this sort of gets us into the conversation about similarities and differences, because I think kind of law is one of the areas where you can kind of see a lot of similarities. In fact, some of the legal systems that are still operated in the world, in Europe, even portions of the United States, are based on this idea of Roman law. Not necessarily directly back to the 12 tables themselves, but the sort of future legal thinking that was going to invoke. Some people also pointed out that there are similarities with sort of, our culture today. Up until about 50 years ago was still a pretty patriarchal society in and of itself. There's been, some movement in more recent decades that women have gotten, far more rights, far more political and economic roles within our society, to a degree that it's making it a lot more dissimilar. But still, I think you see a lot of those vestiges of patriarchy and a patriarchal system still around today. Of course, you still have problems with pay gap, you still have problems with political representation, and so forth. that I think even though things are getting better, there's still some work to do, and you can still probably see some vestiges of European culture, which had been very, very much based upon this very kind of strict patriarchal system, and that really dates back to this Roman time period here. Legally, you can see a lot of comparisons there. Kind of the strong interconnected economy eventually that Rome's going to build. You can see some strong connections there. And yeah, I'd say today we still live in to a certain degree, a stratified society as well, right? There are very clear demarcations between, the upper class, the middle class, lower class, and that maybe they're not as entrenched as far as legal rights and responsibilities and so forth, but you still see a difference in who's representing us politically as far as where a lot of wealth is centered and located, that we are still very much living in a stratified society, and that those classes are still very much with us today, even though they might not be as prominently defined. People also brought up the idea of slavery, right? That Romans had slaves. That was a legal system within the Roman world, and that's something, of course, that we had fought against and were able to abolish in at least this country. But if you look around the world today, there are still problems with it, right? That there are still slavery and examples of that happening and occurring throughout the world today, which you can still look back and say this is a long-going practice that we see recurring over and over again throughout history. All right, so that's where we'll leave it off, but a lot of people made a lot of very good comparisons here to this question. Moving on to question number 2, in what ways was the government of the Roman Republic, once more I want to make sure you're focusing on the Republic and not the Empire here, similar to other governmental forms we have learned about so far this semester, for example, Greek democracy or Mesopotamian kingship? How is it different, and what seems to have made the Roman Republic unique? Well, certainly one of the things that makes the Republic unique is that it is a republic. We haven't really talked about a republic before, in the sense that this was essentially a group of elected individuals who were set about to create the laws and run the society. Out of those individuals, then, they elected people to specific functions. For example, the consuls, who were sort of like their presidents, kind of their executive branch, would be elected for a one-year term, and you'd have 2 of them at the same period of time. So rather similar, like the 2 kings which were appointed in Sparta that we can see, but certainly Sparta was operating under more of an oligarchy system, where that was it wasn't necessarily a representative group from a certain class. It was kind of a smaller number of people in that sense. Republic was the Roman Republic was a little bit more broad in its inclusion, at least from the patrician class, if that makes sense. Also, though, this idea that the Roman Republic was split in that, not necessarily the Republic, but that there was this split between the patricians and the plebeians. The plebeians, of course, sort of had their own governing systems. They had the tribunes. They had their own court systems. In a lot of ways, the plebeians would operate kind of independently to a certain degree of the rest of the republic within the city of Rome. They had sort of their own mechanisms for getting things done, and that's also very unique to Rome, that there was this sort of split between the governing system which was occurring there. You do see some similarities, though, I would say, to more previous versions of kingship, like we see in Mesopotamia or that we saw in China, particularly that a lot of times the consuls and people in high prestige within the Roman Republic would also have religious as well as secular duties. They were sort of considered the high priests of Roman society. They were the ones who'd be able to, for example, perform the auspices, which is looking at sort of the flight of birds to determine the future, if it was a good day to set out for war or not, and so forth. So a lot of that mixture between religious and secular authority, I think you can see that comparison, even though obviously kingship is much more centered with one particular person or one particular family as sort of the head political unit, whereas that political power was spread out to a larger percentage of people within the republic. Of course, that's going to change to a certain degree as time goes on, as there starts becoming more prominent individuals, more prominent families, but for the most part, the republic was defined by the idea of separating that power out. So how is that different from oligarchy and democracy, like we were looking at in Greece? I already kind of mentioned that comparison to oligarchy. Democracy is also a similarity in the sense that it's a little bit more of a representative government. Of course, the idea behind democracy within Athens was that idea that anyone who was a citizen would have that ability to participate within society, participate in essentially all of the decision making. That if they were going to go to war, pretty much all of those citizens who at that time would have been essentially property owning males would have a chance to cast a vote to decide. If they were going to exile someone, the same thing. People who were appointed to positions of authority within the city were all coming from that group, were all being voted upon. Whereas the Republic was much more defined by a smaller number of elected individuals to make decisions for the society in general. And if you think about when the founders of the United States were thinking about what type of government system they wanted, they went essentially for a republic rather than a straight democracy. That's why we essentially have elections and select representatives to represent our interests rather than everyone within the country or within the state voting on every single issue to make a decision. That's sort of the difference that you see there. So that's sort of the comparison and contraction between, I would say, Roman government and the other governing systems that we have seen up until this point in time. All right, changes. Describe the transition from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire. What do you see most as the most important elements which caused this change? In the end, how was the empire different from the Republic? As time goes on, as Rome is more militarily successful, they are able to take over essentially the entire Italian peninsula. They take over Sicily. They get in the Punic Wars with Carthage. They're able to defeat Carthage and take over more locations in North Africa. Eventually, they're taking over portions of Greece and Egypt. And what ends up happening is that even though the government of Rome is still essentially just the city, what they have done through their victories is create an empire. And that starts creating a lot of problems because essentially the Republic was not set up to run an empire. I mean, it was still very much based around the city of Rome. It was still being run like a city government, essentially, even though suddenly now they had interest coming in from multiple locations, multiple people. And really the biggest problem was now that there's all this land, there's all this wealth flowing into Rome, how is that being divided? Who's going to benefit from it? Who should be the ones who are making sort of those decisions? And really, it's trying to sort out and figure out these problems, which ultimately leads to a sort of downward spiral, if you want to think of it that way, of increasingly people getting power and authority within their own hands, using it for their own means, and slowly but surely kind of degrading the power and the authority of the Republic and of the Senate. The Gracchi brothers are a very early example of this, where they were a couple of tribunes, essentially people representing the plebeians, kind of the lower classes of society, who tried essentially to create and institute laws and regulations that were going to try to take some of that wealth and divide it to a larger group of people, bringing them back to more of the plebeian classes. And essentially what ends up happening is both of them end up getting killed in instances of mob violence that were instituted by political rivals or political opponents. And while this didn't necessarily cause the Republic to fall in and of itself, it set a dangerous precedent that going forward, violence became the primary mechanism to deal with political opponents within the Republic, as we're very much going to see within our next example of Marius and Sulla. Marius was a very influential general. He helped win the Jugurthine War, which was a war against a kingdom in North Africa, and Sulla was one of his top generals. And essentially they get into a rivalry, a political rivalry, after that conflict. Marius ends up maintaining the consulship for 8 years in a row, which was unprecedented up until that point in time. Remember, the consulships were supposed to be kind of divided out among kind of the top people within the Senate relatively easily. It wasn't supposed to be a position that one person was going to be able to capitalize on year after year. But Marius does that. He's able to take advantage of his military success to continually be named consul. So that's a dangerous precedent that you're now putting authority in one person for a longer, protracted period of time than kind of the tradition of the Republic, which was to only have a consul be around for 1 year, and they might be able to hold multiple consulships, but it'd be broken up a year here, wait 2 or 3 years, get it again, wait 2 or 3 years, get it again. So it's never one person just being in power, being able to put in their own ideas. Marius's big ambition was to try to redistribute land to his veterans, people who are serving in his army. That's one of the reasons that he keeps getting this support, and it's really they're the main people that he is trying to benefit by giving them, like I said, more access to land, more sort of retirement benefits, if you want to think of it that way. And it does a couple things. It makes his army more loyal to Marius than it does to the Republic, because they see that he's the main person who's operating in their interests, and that there's other people within the Senate who are not, and who do not want to give those benefits to them. Ultimately, there's this political feud which is created between Marius and Sulla. Sulla gets a consulship that Marius wants. When Sulla goes off to fight in a war in Anatolia, Marius and his supporters take over the city. They end up killing a number of Sulla's supporters. And what happens then is that Marius actually dies. And just a couple of sort of his generals are left in place when Sulla with his entire army comes back. Sulla retakes over Rome and then does the exact same thing. He goes after all of Marius's supporters, killing them. He begins a practice known as proscription, which is essentially sort of like an official government hit list, saying that these people, if you kill them, you'll get a percentage of their property. The rest of their property will be confiscated by the state. And a lot of people sort of became almost like professional bounty hunters, where they'd go after these senators and these politicians who were on these prescription lists, turn them in, get a percentage of their property, enrich themselves through that process. And really, it's taking this idea of using violence to essentially promote your cause, and really sets another very dangerous precedent. Not only that Marius set the precedent of using an army to attack Rome and attack political rivals, but then Sulla makes it more systemic, as fact through the prescriptions and so forth. But even that doesn't end the Republic, because what Sulla actually ends up doing, he makes some reforms that he thinks are going to improve things, and then he steps down. He does not maintain the title of dictator, which essentially is what he crowned himself. That idea that he is now one individual in an extreme circumstance who is able to take over all power and all authority. Future people who are in that position would not give up that power, and that's really where you see the decline and the end of the Republic. But Sulla does give it up. He essentially goes and retires onto a country estate. But from that point in time period, too many of those sort of dangerous precedents had been set. Too many factions were still involved in fighting each other in the Senate, that things would only get picked up. Next, you had sort of the first triumvirate of Pompey, Crassus, and Julius Caesar. And really, that is a power sharing. The first triumvirate was essentially a power sharing mechanism where these three realized that they were sort of the top political figures of the age. At that time, a lot of you saw sort of the accounts of Pompey during our document exercise for this week. But they realized that to avoid conflict and try to avoid another Marius Sulla incident, they were going to share power between them. Then they entered into kind of an agreement known as the First Triumvirate, which pretty much was going to be passing the consulship back and forth. They realized that in each of their camps they had enough supporters to make that happen. The problem with that, however, is that Crassus messes the whole thing up by going out and dying. He decides it'd be a great idea to go and take on the Parthians, who were sort of a new iteration of the Persian Empire. They were essentially sort of steppeland nomads who came down, took over the remainder of one of sort of Alexander the Great's previous empires, had reconstituted kind of the Persian Empire, and had a very strong and effective military. And Crassus thought it'd be a great idea to sort of try to gain himself some glory, make himself even sort of more prominent within this triumvirate. Unfortunately, he does a really poor job of it. He brings his army sort of out in the middle of the desert. They're away from any kind of protection. And the Parthians are really excellent horsemen. They can just ride up, continually shoot at the Roman legions, who primarily are on foot. When the cavalry tries to run after them and chase after them, the Parthians just run away until they, turn back. Then they come back and harass them with arrows more. And essentially, Crassus and his entire force are decimated by the Parthians. And that knocked an important third pillar out of this power sharing process, and left it simply to Caesar and Pompey. Pompey eventually sort of becomes seen as the champion of the Republic. He's the one who has more support within the Senate itself, and eventually Julius Caesar has been very militarily successful in his own right up in what was known as Gaul, which is modern-day France, fighting against the European tribes that were living up there. He gets called back to Rome, but essentially is told to leave his legions behind. That they just want him to show up, that he can maintain his authority and his power, but they don't want him showing up to Rome with a huge army. In which case, Caesar pretty much makes the calculation that, no, I like my chances better with my army than without it, takes his army, marches it on Rome. Pompey is forced to flee, gather up his army, and once more you have a confrontation between sort of the two largest military leaders of the Republic. That fight eventually ends in Greece with Caesar defeating Pompey and Pompey's army, and Caesar naming himself dictator in perpetua, essentially dictator for life, and starts making all sorts of new adjustments to the Republic and to the Senate. And you really see under Caesar that can be considered sort of the death nail of the Republic, because he had it in his idea to make himself one single leader for life, take power away from the Senate, and so forth. And of course, this makes him a lot of enemies within the Senate, because they still want to have power and authority, and even people who had once backed him in his efforts realized that he was sort of definitely going against the spirit of the Republic. And that is why he's eventually murdered by some people who had once been his supporter. He's essentially stabbed to death in the Senate. And in doing so, it launches another round of civil wars between sort of very prominent senators, until eventually Caesar Augustus is able to really come in and put an end to the fighting. He takes out the final claimants to the consulship and to the empire, and he's really the one then who institutes the idea of an empire rather than a republic. Even though he sort of gives lip service to the Senate, he says sort of that he's just the first citizen among many. He pretends that he's kind of restoring its authority. No one really believed that. Everyone realized that from this time period forward, it was going to be much more of an imperial model, and much more of a one person having the vast majority of control and power. And that's ultimately the big split that you see between the empire and the republic. That authority is now vested in one position, in the position of the empire. And even though the Senate still has some things to do, they're more or less relegated to a minor role, and it's going to be the emperor, his trusted advisors, and so forth that are going to take over running and administering this much now larger empire that is going to include most of Europe, that's going to include North Africa, that's going to include portions of Western Asia, and is going to become sort of one of the largest and one of the most largest sustained empires in history up until this point in time. But no one really felt going forward that any sort of real power or authority was going to lay within the Republic or within the Senate, and that's the real sort of clear break that you see here with Augustus. All right, moving on from there. List it. I would like you to form two lists for this activity. One would focus on some of Rome's good emperors, Augustus, Claudius, Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius, etc. And a list what aspects made them effective rulers of the empire. For the second list, I'd like you to focus on some of Rome's bad emperors, Caligula, Nero, and the Barracks emperors, and make a list of what made them ineffective rulers. I thought people did a good job with this, sort of recognizing that, like any sort of kingship model, the effectiveness of the government is really based upon whoever the leader is, or whoever the main ruler is. And if you have a very unstable ruler, it makes things very, very difficult for the rest of society. So people like Augustus, Claudius, Hadrian, they are able to set up very strong government systems, very good administrative systems. Rulers like Hadrian and Marcus Aurelius, they're successful in limited military conflicts. They're not trying to vastly expand their empire. They're sort of more interested in protecting what has already been gained, but they're doing it very proactively. They're traveling around from location to location. You see that a lot in Hadrian's document, how he's going from building Hadrian's Wall in Britannia, modern-day Great Britain, to Greece, to Egypt, back to Rome again, and he's constantly moving and constantly traveling and constantly keeping up the empire. So I think when you have sort of those stable personalities in the position who are able to get buy-in from other politicians, military generals, and so forth, that is when you see the strong emperors. Once you start getting to the bad emperors, Caligula, Nero, and so forth, you start seeing that a lot of times, whether it was inexperience, whether it was mental illness, whether it was a number of other factors, other rivals to the throne, competition, generals who want to do their own thing and not listen to you, that starts degrading. So when you have emperors who are, for example, going after senators, issuing prescriptions, persecuting people, for example, Caligula and Nero, it provides a lot of resentment and a lot of pushback from other prominent people within Roman society, and sort of shows you that there was still a check on the emperor's position, that he could get away with a lot, but if he did too much, eventually they were going to be assassinated. And really, I think you can see this tendency to have so much transition from one emperor to the next based upon violence in Rome as an outgrowth of that very violent late Republic period, where that was sort of seen as the politically acceptable way to do a regime change. And Rome is never able to establish a successful succession practice, meaning transitioning power from one person to another in a more or less peaceful manner. Rome is always going to have these issues with, very rarely is an emperor going to be passing power down to a son, for example, or to a family member. They might have their name successor, but a lot of times there's going to be intrigue, there's going to be assassinations that happen. And by the time you get around to the barracks emperors, essentially this is a 100-year period where there's like 30 different emperors, because, emperors are ruling on average for 3 or 4 years before getting assassinated or killed. And there's just no way to successfully run an empire when there's that much transition and when there's that much chaos at the top. And it's only by sort of reestablishing that with Diocletian and eventually Constantine that they're able to sort of bring some stability back to Rome. But really, it's Rome's inability to ever successfully create a succession practice that is followed and is seen as legitimate, that makes it a very kind of constantly chaotic atmosphere for emperors. And it's very surprising that the empire is able to maintain itself for as long as it does, with that oftentimes being the case. But it's because you periodically do have these very good emperors, such as Claudius, Hadrian, and Marcus Aurelius, who are able to make things come back together, who are able to implement some of these policies, make these reforms, and so forth, that the empire is able to continue going for a sustained period of time. All right, and finally, exchanges explain the process by which Christianity spread from a small Jewish cult in an empire into an empire-wide religion. How and why did Christianity appeal to so many people, and how did it intermingle with established Roman ideologies and perspectives? So a lot of people did a good job pointing out sort of the basic foundations of Christianity, the role that Jesus Christ plays in this, the role that his sacrifice and his death end up having as far as spreading the religion, particularly to those very early Christians and believers of the faith. And in a lot of ways, people pointed out that Christianity is once more one of these axial age religions that spoke to people in the same way, and sort of fulfilled those same human needs that other Axial Age religions fulfilled, whether it was Judaism, whether it was Zoroastrianism, whether it's Hinduism, whether it's Taoism. In a lot of ways, it's operating in the same function, that it has not just sort of the mythical aspect of it, it has the sort of explanatory aspect of it, but also has the social function of it. It has that idea of peace, of support for women, for people of the lower classes. It has that idea of reward in the afterlife. And a lot of those aspects that are very appealing of Axial Age religions, Christianity certainly has. And I would say that ultimately is one of the biggest reasons that it is successful in the Roman Empire, because the Roman Empire really did not have one of those Axial Age religions until the coming of Christianity. Of course, Roman religion, traditional Roman religion, was based upon Greek mythology, which was still very much centered around those anthropomorphic nature gods. And so much of Roman religion was based upon the city of Rome. You have the Rammus and Remus legend. You have sort of the war against the Etruscans and the freedom they're able to win from that. You have the main temples and religious structures in the city of Rome itself. Most of the religious rites can only be performed in Rome. So even though Rome has this vast empire, it doesn't have a religion that is really going to speak to a large group of people, particularly because most of the people now living in the empire are not living in the city of Rome. So Roman religion really offers them very, very little, since they're not able to make those same sort of connections that a Roman living in Rome would be able to make. Christianity now is going to have something to offer them. It has a much more sort of universal message that is going to appeal to them in a way that Roman religion never did. So I'd say one is certainly a lack of competition in the way of Axial Age religions. I mean, for example, you don't see Christianity spreading nearly as well throughout the rest of the Near East or into Asia. It certainly will have pockets developing, and we'll be talking about that next week along the Silk Road and so forth. But you never see, for example, a large percentage of people in the Persian Empire converting Christianity, because they already have Zoroastrianism, which functions very similar to Christianity. You never see a large population in India converting to Christianity, because they already have Buddhism, Hinduism, Jainism, which are fulfilling those same sort of Axial Age functions to people. The Roman Empire never had anything like that, so it was sort of theologically wise, kind of ripe for the picking, if you want to think of it that way. Manichaeism, a sort of outgrowth of Zoroastrianism, is also going to become very prominent within the Roman religion for a short period of time. We'll be talking about that once more next week. But eventually, between those two, Christianity sort of becomes the one that appeals to the most people, primarily because it is very much more inclusive. Of course, very early on in the religion, you have people like Paul of Tarsus here, who decide that Christianity is going to be a message and a religion that is going to function like that it is going to be motivated and upon evangelization, essentially spreading the religion to people who do not believe in that faith, in a way that Judaism really never was. Judaism was very much more centered upon the Jewish people. They were God's chosen people, and they were okay with that. They never felt really a need to go out and expand that to other people. Whereas Christianity very quickly becomes a religion that is one of its main focuses is spreading it and introducing it to people who do not believe it, or who believe a different sect of it, or some nature. And people like Paul, people who go around preaching and spreading this message very early on, traveling around Rome, becomes very much how it is spread, until you get pockets of Christianity springing up all over the empire. And even when it's not the empire's official religion, that of course isn't going to come until Constantine, you still see it spreading and being relatively successful, despite periodic time periods of pushback and of persecution and so forth, for example, under Nero. But really, I think Rome also had a number of other advantages besides just sort of looking or being susceptible to an Axial Age religion. The fact that travel was so easy for a Roman citizen, such as Paul, that he was able to travel from one location to the other over a very good road system, most times very safe road systems, and that sort of universal perspective that the empire had matched very well also with Christianity and they really, throughout time, start piggybacking off of one another. Of course, a lot of people mentioned the ultimate conversion of an emperor in the form of Constantine to Christianity. He sort of was very well informed about Christianity prior to his conversion. His wife was a Christian. There was a certain percentage of Christians within his army and so forth. And then he, in sort of this dream, has this symbol of the cross before one of his battles, and he ultimately attributes his victory to that cross, and from there converts to Christianity and sort of makes it the official religion of the empire. And of course, it's going to spread it very heavily then to Western Asia with the establishment of Constantinople and so forth, also which we'll be talking about in more detail next week. But that's really some of the main reasons why Christianity becomes so successful and is able to spread and intermingle with these sort of established Roman ideologies and perspectives. All right, let's hop on over and take a look at our document exercises here. So we're just going to kind of go through and point out the portions of the documents that apply to the various questions, how you could have used them, and some of the quotes that you could have used. So let's start with Pompey the Great. And I think from this first sort of paragraph here, you get a pretty good sense of sort of his charismatic nature, his popularity, some of his sort of physical characteristics. For example, seeming to anticipate his eloquence and win upon the affections of people before he spoke. His beauty, even in his bloom of youth, had something in it, at once gentleness and dignity, and when his prime of manhood came, the majesty of kingliness of his character at once became visible in it. His hair sat somewhat hollow or rising a little, and this, with the languishing motion of his eyes, seemed to form a resemblance in his face, though perhaps more talked of than really apparent, to the statues of the king of Alexander. So from a very young age, Pompey being compared here to Alexander the Great really shows you how physically he looked very kingly, but also that sort of gentleness and dignity that he had. People sort of realized that he was sort of a born leader. Very quickly in this next section, though, you see one of the big differences between Hadrian's document and Pompey's document, and that is the sense that Pompey is living and operating in a time of crisis, where it's sort of one crisis after another, one sort of civil war popping up after another, and you can really see the decline of the Republic and the political crises that are propping up here much more than any sense you get of that in Hadrian's document. So for example here, thus Cinna being slain, Carbo, a tyrant, yet more senseless than he, took the command and exercised it, while Sylla meantime was approaching, much to the joy and satisfaction of most people who in their present evils were ready to find some comfort in it, but were in the exchange of a master. So sort of showing how these, they call them tyrants here, were able to come forward and take control. And of course, Pompey is going to be portrayed here as fighting back against them, although I'm sure people in their camps would have tried to portray Pompey as being just as much of a tyrant as they were. Coming down here accordingly, he, meaning Pompey, solicited the Presentines for their assistance, who cordially embraced his motion and rejected the messengers sent from Carbo, insomuch that a certain Vindius, taking upon him to say that Pompey was come from the schoolroom to put himself at the head of the people, they were so incensed that they fell forth upon this Vindius and killed him. So Vindius was essentially insulting Pompey, sort of saying he was too young, coming right from the schoolroom, and was just trying to get ahead of himself to take control, and that his supporters were sort of so fervent that they killed this Vindius for insinuating it. And this really shows you once more this political violence that is breaking out and occurring, that just for bad-mouthing a political leader, someone can essentially be murdered in the middle of the Senate here. And yeah, so just very much give you the sense of the political crises that are occurring. What does Pompey do from there, though? Henceforth, Pompey, finding a spirit of government upon him, thought not above 23 years of age, nor deriving an authority by commission from any man, took the privilege to grant himself full power, and causing a tribunal to be erected in the marketplace of Axium, that being a city, a populous city, he expelled 2 of their principal men, brothers of the name Vendidius, who were acting against him in Carbo's interest, commanding them by public edict to depart the city, and then proceeding to levy soldiers, issuing out commissions and centurions and other officers according to the form of military discipline. So they're saying in this city, Pompey essentially just grabs control of it, even though he doesn't have any authority or commission. He is so charismatic that people are just kind of letting him come in, raise an army, kick out these sort of political rivals of his. And once more, I'm going to repeat this again, shows you sort of how chaotic this is, that generals are kind of going around town by town, converting him to their interests and so forth. Moving on down, Pompey was now was no way alarmed. He was not alarmed at this, but collecting all of his troops into one body and placing his horse in the front of the battle, where he himself was in person, he signaled out and bent all of his forces against Brutus. And when the Celtic horsemen of the enemy's side rode out to meet him, Pompey himself, encouraged hand to hand with the foremost and stoutest among them, killed him with his spear. So sort of showing the military prowess of Pompey, that not only is he a great politician, but he's a very brave military leader. He's going to put himself at the front of his troops. And a lot of people brought this up as sort of showing his personality, that he wasn't afraid, he was brave, he was able to, or he was willing to go out and lead his men from the front. And that also gained him, of course, a lot of notoriety, not just within his army, but in society in general. Also talks about here, next after these, Scipio, the consul, came to attack him, and with as little success, for before the armies could join or be within the throw of a javelin, Scipio's soldiers saluted Pompey's and came over to them. So essentially, Pompey was able to gain Scipio's soldiers onto his own side, and Scipio was forced to flee. So to the point where even his enemy soldiers are abandoning their generals and coming on to Pompey's side, really shows you sort of the personality that he had. Though a second triumph was decreed him, a triumph is like a big military parade to celebrate a victory. They were only given out in for example, when very prominent military feats were accomplished. So a triumph is a big deal, and to have two triumphs, pretty young in his life, was considered pretty prestigious for Pompey. Though a second triumph was decreed him and he was declared consul, yet all these honors did not seem so great an evidence of his power and glory as the ascendant which he had over Crassus. Crassus, remember, was that third person in the first triumvirate. For he, the wealthiest among all the statesmen, Crassus was very, very rich of the time and was eloquent and greatest too, who had looked down on Pompey himself and on all others beneath him, durst not appear a candidate for the consulship before he had applied to Pompey. So saying even Crassus, who was one of the wealthiest senators, he was able to buy a lot of support with all this vast wealth he had, was not able to politically challenge Pompey for the consulship. Eventually, Crassus, of course, is going to be able to enter into the triumvirate with Pompey and Caesar. Crassus prevailed most in the Senate, and Pompey's power was no less with the people, having restored to them the office of tribune, and having allowed the courts to judicate to be transferred back to the knights by a new law. So kind of once more making these legal reforms that Pompey is doing to increase his popularity amongst the people, even though Crassus is still very popular within the Senate. And once more, you can see the sort of the political maneuverings that Pompey is having to deal with here that you're not going to have to see in Hadrian's time. Hadrian's always going to be the top dog, and even though he's traveling around, engaging in some skirmishes and so forth, it's not an internal struggle with him. Finally then, the senior censor examined him. Pompeius Magnus, I demand of you whether you have served the full time in the wars that are prescribed by law. Yes, replied Pompey with a loud voice, I have served all, and all under myself as general. The people hearing this gave a great shout and made such an outcry for delight that there was no appeasing it, and the censors rising from their judgment seat accompanied him home to gratify the multitude who followed after, clapping their hands and shouting. So really you get an idea of what a popular figure Pompey is here. He was sort of very much beloved by the people, if not his political rivals. But ultimately, in the end, that's not going to be enough. That military defeat he's going to suffer at the hands of Caesar is going to tip the scales. But you definitely see how Pompey seemed to be fighting on the side of the people. Eventually, he's going to be siding on the side of the Republic, but he is just unsuccessful in doing so. All right, looking at Hadrian. In many places, he visited the frontiers, which were not separated from the barbarians by the rivers. Hadrian raised a kind of wall by driving into the ground great piles. Yeah, so really, first from the get-go here from Hadrian, you can see he's very active. He's moving from place to place. He's creating fortifications. But as far as Pompey's main goal was sort of maintaining order and establishing political power within Rome and within the Senate. Hadrian's trying to maintain power and control within a larger empire. So that's another big difference you can see between the time period of Pompey and the time period of Hadrian. Then he sailed by way of Asia to the islands Achaia, essentially Greece, and after the example of Hercules and Philip, he was admitted to the Eleusinian Mysteries, so kind of the Greek mystery cult. He bestowed many benefits upon the Athenians and presided at their games, essentially the Olympic Games there. So you can see that he's sort of culturally participating in the various locations of his empire. That's sort of one of the things that he sees as important, and very much I would say one of the things that are making him a good emperor and a good Roman leader, that he's interested in going around and participating in the traditions and the religions of the various aspects of his realm. After that, returning from Africa to Rome, he went quickly again to the east, and passing by way of Athens, he dedicated the public works which he had formerly commenced there, such as Temple to Jupiter the Olympian, and an altar upon which he bestowed his own name. So kind of building temples and fulfilling more sort of religious obligations to once more Greece here. While traversing the provinces, he punished according to the crimes the various governors and procurators, and he did so with such severity that he seemed to actually stimulate their accusers. So you can see that he was sort of a very harsh judge here, but that he was going around dispensing law, another kind of a prominent thing that Roman leaders are supposed to do. You saw Pompey doing that when he was able to sort of take over those cities, and what he was trying to do within the Senate. Of course, the biggest difference between them is that while Pompey had to still operate and work within this political system, Hadrian is able to just sort of go around and dispense it at his will. While sailing on the Nile, he lost his beloved favorite Antonius, or Antinius, I should say, whom he mourned over as a woman. There are various stories about this young man. Some say he sacrificed himself to save Hadrian's life. Others give wildly differing accounts as to the emperor's liking for him. And I think what you're really seeing here is some evidence that perhaps there could have been a homosexual relationship between Hadrian and Antinius. The author doesn't come right out and say it, but if you know anything about Roman history, this would not be completely unprecedented. I mean, essentially, there wasn't going to be too many checks on the relationships that an emperor was going to be getting in. And even though homosexuality was not the norm within the empire, it wasn't something that was, I would say, particularly harshly rooted out or being fought against. And even though it wouldn't be something that a Roman emperor would probably come out and publicize openly and widely, it probably would not have been that big of a deal either. So there's something kind of another interesting tidbit that you could pick up on here. This ruler loved poetry and cultivated carefully all branches of literature. He understood likewise arithmetic, geometry, and painting. He danced and sang extremely well, his bent for sensuous pleasure being extreme. So really, what's more, some getting into the personality, kind of that first question, the personality of the rulers, you can really see that Hadrian was trying to sort of be a Renaissance man. As good as he was a political leader, as much as he was traveling around performing these functions of the state, he also had sort of a very intricate private life. He had a lot of hobbies. He was very smart. You know, he liked arithmetic, geometry, painting, dancing and singing. He liked having a good time, and so forth. Now severe, now merry, now voluptuous, now self-contained, now cruel, now merciful, this emperor seemed never the same. He enriched his friends liberally, but finally growing suspicious of some, put them to death or ruined them. I saw a lot of people using this quote within their answers, and I think it's a very interesting one because once more it also shows you a lot of the personality of the emperor. How he did sort of seem to have a split personality where he could go from sort of one extreme to another. But particularly this last piece here, he enriched his friends liberally, but finally growing suspicious of some, put them to death or ruined them. A lot of people sort of pointed this saying that Hadrian was cruel and that he was sort of dangerous to be around, and while it certainly may be true, thinking about everything we know about Roman emperors, and how quite oftentimes, more often than not actually, they were deposed by their friends who they've at one point in time favored, or were deposed through military coups and so forth. It was probably a very good idea for a Roman emperor to have a healthy level of paranoia, because quite oftentimes everyone was out to get you. So it seemed like Hadrian was very willing to keep a close eye on those people he favored and those people of power underneath him, and that was probably another reason why he ultimately did have a long and successful rule and reign as emperor. He enjoyed literary and philosophical discussions, but it was not safe to defeat him in them, which I think is a great line. And Fervonius, the famous philosopher and orator, when his friends blamed him for surrendering to Hadrian's criticism as to his use of a word, when he had a good authority on his side, laughed and replied, "You can never persuade me, good friends, that the commander of 30 legions is not the best qualified critic in the world." I love that quote. I mean, it's very, very true. You can debate with someone, but if it's someone who has as much authority and power as the Roman emperor, yeah, you're going to know when to cut your losses and to say, you know what, that's a really good point. I never thought about that. Great idea. And you may think that's absurd, but I'd say to a lesser extent, people do that all the time. People, when you're talking with your boss or someone who's higher up the ladder, sometimes they seem like they have a really good idea, and there's only so far you can push back because, hey, if I want to keep climbing up, if I want to, be safe in my job, I can't criticize the person with all the authority too much. So I think that's a sort of very interesting personality trait that I would say still holds true today. So people are still able to use that very well as well in kind of depicting Hadrian's personality. He awarded to children of prescribed persons. Once more, these are persons who would have been killed in that idea of prescriptions, that kind of official government hit list that was put out. A 12th part of their father's estate. He did not admit accusations for the crime of lese majestate, which essentially means criticizing the emperor, punishing people for just sort of speaking opposition or bad mouthing his rule. Which oftentimes other emperors, would not have. If you insulted the emperor in some way, that was seen as this great crime, whereas Hadrian apparently said, it's not that big of a deal. Another line that a lot of people took, he took away the right of masters to kill their slaves, requiring that if the slaves deserved it, they should be condemned to death by regular judges. And I think that's an interesting point, that he actually was coming down on some legal rulings on the slide of enslaved individuals here, saying that they had to go through the same legal system as non-slaves. And I thought that was a very interesting tidbit here. So you can see that he did actually have some empathy for some of the people who were operating under him. At least it seems that from this document. Hadrian also most agreeably style in conversation, even towards persons of decidedly humble ranks. And once more, I think you kind of get this idea of the personality of Hadrian, where he wasn't overly stuck up about his position. He didn't persecute people who offended him. That he did have some people other than himself's best interest in mind. That he was willing to travel to various places of his empire. And that, and I think a lot of people pointed out very good aspects that all that sort of led up to, and a very interesting comparison between sort of the cult of personality and the very popular nature of Pompey versus, once more, a very strong personality in Hadrian. But you can really see how both of them were operating within their own time periods, and you can really see how the Republic had transitioned to the Empire through looking at these two documents as well. All right, thank you for sticking me for such a long period of time. I will talk to everyone again next week. Bye-bye.